In this video, I'm gonna show you how you can create a money plant in Blender so you can buy an RTX 3090. And not only that, you can use this method to create other plants also. And if you want to create more plants, then you can watch my previous tutorials by clicking the I button. So first, I photographed some images of money plant leaves. Then I cut them out and I put them into a single image. And also I adjusted the hues a little so that the leaves are of the same color. And also I made the shadows brighter so that there are not any dark spots on the texture, and instead of using a transparent background, I filled the background with a green color because instead of using alpha channel, we are gonna model the leaves. So let's hop into Blender and let's make the plant. And as always, I'm gonna select everything and delete them. Then I'm gonna go to top view and I'm gonna drag and drop this image. You can download this by following the link in the description. Then I'll press Alt G to move it in the center of the world. Then I'm going to go to Object Data Properties and I'll enable opacity. Then I'll decrease that down to give it a little bit of transparency. And I'm going to move this to the right a little bit. And to make the leaf, I'm going to add a plane. Then go to Wireframe View and then press Tab to go to Edit Mode and move these vertices to trace the leaf. And don't make it super detailed, just make the basic shape. And for this midrib, I'm gonna add a loop cut and I'm gonna slide this to the right, and I'm gonna move this vertex to the right over here. And now I'm gonna select these bottom vertices and I'm gonna extrude them down over here, and I'm gonna move this to the left and this one to the right to fit the leaf. And now I'm going to select these bottom vertices again and I'm going to extrude them down over here, and I'm going to move this over here and this one to over here, and I'm going to select these again and extrude them down, and I'm going to move this over here and this one over here. And now let's add a subdivision surface modifier of level 2 to give it more subdivisions and also make it smooth. And now go to edit mode and add more loop cuts to give it more details. So now I'm gonna add a loop cut over here and I'm gonna move this to over here. I'm gonna go to wireframe view. I'm gonna move this over here and this one to the left over here, and also I'm gonna move this over here. And now I'm gonna add a loop cut over here and I'm gonna move this vertex to the left over here and this one to the left as well, and I'm gonna move this to the left a little, just like that. And now I'm gonna select these top vertices and I'm gonna move them up over here. And now to make these rounded parts, you could just select this edge loop and extrude that to make that part, but after that we have to deform the leaf. And when we do that, you can see that it gives us this pinched surface, and to prevent that from happening, I'm going to undo these steps. Then add a loop cut, and now you can press E, and now it's kind of leaning to this edge loop, and that's what we want. And now press left mouse button to drop it over here. And also add a loop cut on this side, and now press E, and now it's leaning on this edge loop, but we want the opposite, so now you can press F and now it's leaning on this edge loop, and now drop it over here. And now select this edge loop and extrude it up over here, and I'm gonna go to wireframe view. And whenever two or more vertices get closer to each other, the surface gets sharper. So I'm going to just select these vertices and space these out a little bit, just like this. And now I'm going to select these vertices and I'm going to move them up over here. And I'm going to move this up a little bit also over here, and this one over here also. And now let's add a loop cut over here also. I'm gonna double tap G to slide this vertex, and these two vertices are on top of each other, so I'm gonna select these vertices and I'm gonna edge slide these over here, and also I'm gonna slide these also over here, and I'm gonna slide this over here and this one over here. And now let's add a loop cut on both of these sides, and because we added a loop cut, we also have to move this vertex so that it fits the leaf. I'm gonna slide this to the right and this one to the left and to the up a little. I'm gonna space these out a little bit more, just like this. And our leaf is totally flat, so let's deform the leaf to give it depth. But before doing that, I'm gonna move this image down over here, and now let's select the leaf, go to edit mode, and then I'll select this edge loop by holding Alt, and also I'm gonna select these four vertices also. And now let's enable the proportional editing. You can also press the hotkey, which is O, and now move these down, and now the vertices closer to these will also be affected, and you can increase or decrease the fall off by scrolling the scroll wheel. Then I'm gonna go to side view and I'm gonna deselect everything. Then I'm gonna select these vertices at the tip, and I'm gonna rotate these a little by increasing the fall off, just like this. And now I'm gonna move these down over here, and now I'm gonna rotate these again but by decreasing the fall off. And now I'm gonna select these vertices and I'm gonna move these up on the Z axis, something like this. Then I'm gonna select these vertices and I'm gonna move these down over here. Then I'm gonna deselect these two vertices and I'm gonna bring these down a little over here. Then I'm gonna select these two vertices and I'm gonna move these up on the Z axis, something like this. And now I'm gonna select this whole edge loop by holding Alt, and now I'm gonna move this down a little by decreasing the fall off, something like this. And now I'm gonna just make some variations. And keep in mind that when you are moving these vertices, you have to move these only on the Z axis and not on any other axis, and the reason is because we have to unwrap this leaf on this texture. And now I'm gonna shade smooth my leaf, and now it's looking pretty good. And now I'm gonna add a solidify modifier to give my leaf a little bit of thickness, and I'm gonna move this before the subdivision modifier so it's smoother. And now in the edge data, I'm gonna increase the crease inner a little bit to make this edge a little bit sharper, and also you can increase the crease outer to make this edge also sharper, but I'm gonna decrease that down to something around over here. And also I'm gonna decrease down the thickness to 0.007. And now you guys have got a homework. You have to make these two leaves. And if you don't make these two leaves, then the punishment is you have to hit that subscribe button. And if you made the leaves, then you still hit that subscribe button.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
And here are the leaves that I've made. And instead of making that into separate meshes, I just made that into one single mesh so that it's easy to unwrap, and we'll separate the meshes after making the materials. So now let's unwrap this so we can apply the texture. So now open up a new workspace and change that to UV editor, and now open up the image texture that we added and zoom out. Then go to top view and then go to edit mode and select everything, and then press U to unwrap these and choose project from view. And now the UVs are good but they are squeezed. So to fix that, I'm gonna open up a new workspace again and change that to shader editor. And now let's make a new material, and I'm gonna call that leaf. then add an image texture, and we don't need to again open up the image texture, we can just link the image texture from here. And now let's connect this to the color, and now let's unwrap this again, and now it's no longer squeezed, but the UVs are small, so you can just scale those up and move those on these leaves. So now I'm gonna move the mouse over the UV editor and press Ctrl space to zoom into full screen. And now let's select everything and scale those up. And now you can select this whole UV island by moving the mouse over that and pressing L. And now let's move that into its place. And the UVs are smaller, but we shouldn't scale this UV island alone. And the reason is the size of these UV islands won't match anymore. And this UV island will have more pixels than these ones. So if we want to scale this UV island, we have to select everything and scale everything up. So now let's scale these up, and now let's move this and let's see if the scale is correct or not. It's getting a little bit smaller, so select everything again and scale that up, maybe like this. And now let's move this. And now the UVs are correctly placed, but the UVs aren't fitting the texture perfectly. And let me zoom out of full screen by pressing Ctrl space. And actually, when I disable the subdivision surface modifier, and now you can see that our mesh isn't lining up with the texture. But because we added the subdivision surface modifier, it rounds off those edges. And you don't need to worry about these UVs, because when we add the subdivision surface modifier, the textures are also now correct. And the colors are looking washed out, so I'm gonna go to render properties, and in the color management, the look is set to none, but I'm gonna change that to high contrast, and now it looks better. And now I'm gonna hide this image because we don't need that anymore. And now let's make the materials. So I'm gonna give myself a little bit more space over here. So first I'm gonna add a color ramp, then I'm gonna connect the color to the factor. And if you haven't enabled the node wrangler add-on, then you should enable that from the preferences and check this checkbox. And now we can hold Ctrl Shift and left click on any node to preview that. And now I'm gonna move this step to the right a little, something about over here, and I'm gonna make this color a little brighter, something like this. And I'm gonna move this step to the left over here, and I'm gonna make this color a little darker, something like this. I'm gonna move that to something over here. And now let's connect this color to the roughness. And now where these dark colors are, our materials will be shinier than where these lighter colors are. And if you want to know more about that, then you can watch my previous tutorial on materials. And now let's preview the principled BSDF by holding Ctrl Shift and left clicking on that. And now I'm going to go to rendered view, and I'm going to deselect the scene world and scene lights option because I want to light the scene with an HDRI. And now it looks better than before. Maybe I'll increase this color a little bit, something like this. And also I'm gonna move this top to the left a little, and now it looks better. And to add small little details, I'm gonna add a bump node. Then I'll connect the color to the height and the normal to the normal. And the strength is too high, so I'm going to decrease that down to something around 0.1. And let's see how that looks. Maybe 0.05. And now I'm going to increase the subsurface scattering a little bit, around 0.07. And now the light is passing through the leaf. And in the subsurface color, I'm gonna plug in the same image texture, but it's still looking reddish, and the reason is because the red light is passing the farthest underneath this object. So now I'm gonna decrease down this red value to about 0.5, and I'll increase this green value to around 0.7, and now it's looking greener. And also, to add a little bit of translucency, I'm gonna add a translucent BSDF. Then I'll add an edge shader, and now connect this translucent BSDF to the edge shader, and now connect this color to the color. And to control the strength of translucency, I'm gonna add a hue saturation node, and now you can increase or decrease this value to change the amount of translucency. So I'm gonna decrease that down to 0.7, and now it's looking pretty good. And now let's create the stalk of the leaves. So I'm gonna move these to the right to give myself more space, and now I'm gonna go to side view, and now I'm gonna move this to something over here. Then I'm gonna go to top view, and I'm gonna move this to the right so that this line is in the middle. And now let's go to edit mode, and now I'll add a cube, and now I'll delete the top and the bottom faces, and now we get a cylinder shape because we added the subdivision surface modifier. And now select this cylinder by moving the mouse over that and pressing L to select linked parts. And now I'm going to scale this down except the Z axis by pressing S, then pressing Shift Z. And now scale this down to something like this. And now I'm going to select these bottom vertices, and I'm going to move those up over here. And now select these vertices, and now I'm going to move this over here so that it connects to the leaf, and move this down to over here. And now let's go to side view, and now I'm going to add a loop cut over here, and now I'm going to move that to the right to something over here. And now I'm gonna select these bottom vertices, and I'll press Ctrl I to select the inverse. And now I'm gonna move these to the left just a little bit, something like this. And then also I'll add a loop cut over here and just move this so slightly. And also I'll select this edge loop and I'll rotate that a little. And this stalk is looking a little bit fatter to me, so I'm gonna select this by pressing L. And now I'll press Alt S to shrink this down a little, something like this. And also I'll shade this smooth, maybe a little bit fatter, just like this. Yeah, this looks good. And now make the stalks for these two leaves also. And before making the stalks, I'm gonna move this down so that the stalks are not of the same size. And also I'm gonna move this down a little, just like this. And now make the stalks.
A few minutes later.
So now I have made these stalks. So now let's create a new material for that. I'm gonna name that stem, and I'm gonna make this workspace wider. And let's go to edit mode and assign the stem material to all of these stems. And now let's add an image texture, and now open up the stem texture. You can download that by following the link down in the description. And now connect the color to the color. And now let's unwrap the UVs. So I'm gonna go to edit mode, and now I'll select this whole edge loop by holding Alt, and now mark this as a seam. And now let's select this part by pressing L, and now let's unwrap this. And here I'm gonna select the stem texture. I'm gonna disable proportional editing because we don't need that. And now let's scale all the UVs up. And now I'm gonna rotate that 90 degrees. And now let's move that over here. And this is bigger than the texture, so I'm gonna scale these down so that it fits the texture. And you can see the UVs are distorted and they are not even. So to fix that, I'm gonna choose a face which is the most identical to a rectangle. So in this case I'm gonna work with this rectangle, and now scale this down on the x-axis by a value of 0, and now it's gonna flatten the edge if it's not. So now press enter, and now I'll do the same over here also. And now for this edge I'm gonna scale that down on the y-axis followed by 0, and now let's do the same over here also. And now it's a perfect rectangle. So now let's select everything and choose face select mode, and now deselect this face and now select that again, and now it's the active face. So now press U and choose follow active quads, and now the UVs are fixed and they are not distorted anymore. So now I'm gonna make the UVs fit on this texture. So I'm gonna scale this down and I'm gonna move this over here, scale this up a little bit more, and now I'm gonna scale this up on the y-axis so that it fits the texture. And now this is good. So I'm gonna go out of full screen mode by pressing Ctrl space, and now let's see how that looks. And now this is looking good. So now let's unwrap these stems also.
A few moments later.
And now I've unwrapped the UVs. So now let's work on the material. And now make sure that the image texture is selected, and now press Ctrl T to add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. And now I'll scale up the texture twice. And I'm gonna select these and I'm gonna move these to the left. And now I'm gonna add a color ramp, and now I'll connect the color to the factor, and now let's preview the color ramp. I'm gonna move these over here, and now I'm gonna move this stop to the left over here. And now I'm gonna make these white values a little bit darker, something like this, and I'm gonna move this over here. And now I'm gonna move this to the right to something like over here. And now I'll make this dark color a bit lighter, something like this, and I'm gonna move this to the left a little like this. And now let's connect this to the roughness, and now let's preview the principal BSDF. I'm gonna go to rendered view and I'll change the HDRI. Maybe I'll increase this a little to something like this. And now let's add a bump node to add small details. And now I'll connect the color to the height and the normal to the normal. And the strength is too high, so I'm going to decrease that down. And now let's increase the subsurface scattering a little, and now connect the color to the subsurface color. And in the subsurface radius I'm going to decrease down the red value to 0.5, and I'll increase the green to 0.7. And also I'm going to add a translucent BSDF, and I'll add an add shader. And now I'll connect this translucent BSDF to the add shader, and now I'll connect this color to the translucent BSDF, and I'll add an hue saturation node, and I'll decrease down the value a little bit. And now let's separate these leaves into different meshes. So I'm gonna go to edit mode, and now I'll select these parts and I'll press P, and I'll separate these by selection. And now this is a different mesh. And now let's select this, and now select these parts and now separate these by selection. And now these are separate meshes. And now let's set the origin point of these objects where their stem ends, so that when we instance the leaves, they'll be spawned from the point where their stem ends. So I'm gonna right click and I'll set the origin to 3D cursor. And now its origin point has been set where the 3D cursor is. So now I'm gonna select this leaf, and now I'll go to edit mode, and now I'll select these bottom vertices, and I'll press Shift S and choose cursor to selected. And now the 3D cursor is at the bottom of this stem. So now I'm gonna set the origin to 3D cursor. And now I'll do the same over here also. I'm gonna select these bottom vertices, and I'll press Shift S and choose cursor to selected, then press right click and set the origin to 3D cursor. And now let's correct the scale of our leaves. So for comparison, I'm gonna add an armature human metallic, and you can add that if you have enabled the rigify add-on in the preferences. And now we get a human rig, and this is the scale of a human, and these are our leaves. And these are so huge, and the length of this leaf is about 5.5 centimeters. So I'm going to scale this leaf down on the y-axis, which means its length, until the y dimension value is roughly about 0.055 meters, which means 5.5 centimeters. So I'm going to scale that down something like this. I'm gonna move this over here, and this leaf is about 7.5 centimeters. So now I'm gonna select both of these leaves, and I'm gonna select this one last, and now I'll scale this down until the y dimension value is about 0.075 meters. So let's scale this down to something about over here, and now I'm gonna move this closer to these leaves, and I'm going to move this over here. And now I'm going to recenter the 3D cursor in the middle of the grid by pressing Shift C. And now let's quickly model a part. So for that, I'm going to add a mesh circle, and now let's go to edit mode and scale these vertices down to something about like this. And you can use this human reference to get an idea of the scale. So I'm going to go to edit mode, and I'm going to extrude these up on the Z axis to something about over here, and I'll select this bottom vertices and I'll scale this down a little to something like this. Maybe I'll scale this down a little bit more, something like this. And now I'm going to add a loop cut in the middle, and now I'll scale this up to something like this, and I'll press Ctrl B to bevel these edges, and I'll add one more segment by scrolling up the scroll wheel. And now I'll select these bottom vertices and I'll extrude this, and I'll cancel the movement by pressing the right mouse button. And now let's scale this down like this, and now I'll extrude this again and cancel the movement, and now I'll press M to merge this as center. And now let's enable smooth shading, and it's looking weird at the bottom, so I'm going to enable auto smooth in the normals, and now it looks good, but at the bottom it's pretty sharp. So I'm going to go to the modifiers, and now I'm going to add a bevel modifier to bevel the edges, and the amount is so high, so I'm going to decrease that down to something like this, and I'll increase the segments to 3. And also to add thickness to the part, I'm going to add a solidify modifier, and now I'll move this before the bevel modifier so that these edges are also beveled. And I'm going to set the offset to 1 so that the thickness is inside of the part. And now I'm going to add a loop cut over here, and now I'll duplicate this edge loop by pressing Shift D, and I'll separate it by selection. And I'll remove all of these modifiers because we don't need that, and also we don't need this edge loop anymore. So I'm going to press X and I'll dissolve these edges. And now let's select this edge loop, and I'll go to edit mode, and I'll select everything and press Ctrl F, and I'll choose grid fill to fill this circle with nice quads. And quads are faces which have 4 vertices. And let's see if there are any flipped normals by enabling this face orientation option. And yes, there are. You can see that it's red colored. So I'm going to go to edit mode and make sure that everything is selected, and I'll press Shift N to recalculate those normals. And now I'll disable that face orientation option because we don't need that anymore. And also I'm going to choose matte cap shading, and I'll choose the color to be random. And now let's create the stems and the branches. So for that we first need a single vertex. So you can add a cube and go to edit mode and merge the vertices at center. And now we have a single vertex. But if you want to get more fancier and more faster, then you can by going to the preferences and enabling this extra objects option, and I keep this enabled all the time. And now when we go to add, mesh, we get a bunch of more objects, and now we can add a single vertex, and also it takes us to the edit mode. But I'm going to go out of edit mode and I'll move this vertex to up something over here. And now let's go to edit mode, and now you can press Ctrl right click, and now it's gonna extrude where the mouse is. And now let's extrude to make these stems or branches or whatever they call.
A few minutes later.
And now here's what I've made. And now let's go to edit mode and go to top view and enable proportional editing. And now let's move and rotate these a little so that they are not perfectly straight. And also I'm gonna hide this human because we don't need that.
1 minute 37 seconds later.
And now let's add an skin modifier, and now we get this type of garbage thing. But now we can go to edit mode, select everything, and now we can press Ctrl A to scale this down. And now let's add another subdivision surface modifier to make this smooth. And also I'm going to decrease down the render level down to 1. And now let's enable smooth shading so that it's smooth and nothing happens, and it's because we have to enable the smooth shading from the skin modifier, and now it's smooth. And also let's go to edit mode, and I'm gonna enable proportional editing, and now let's scale down the tips. And also let's add some scale variations. And also you can add a loop cut over here. And I'm going to scale this down a little. I'm going to scale this up a little. And now it's looking pretty good. So now let's make a material for this stem also. So I'm gonna go to rendered view, and now I'm gonna link the same stem material to that. And it's not looking that good, and the reason is this material is using the UVs to map the texture. But the problem is that it doesn't have any UVs, and also we can't unwrap this because these are only vertices and it's not like solid mesh. And when you press U, you can see that these are gray and we can't unwrap our mesh. So now you can apply all of these modifiers by selecting this mesh, right clicking on that and going to convert mesh. And now we can select everything and unwrap this. But now the problem is, if we want to modify this stem, we can't do that easily as if we used the skin modifier. So now I'm gonna undo these steps, and now I'm gonna show you a way you can make this material better without applying all the modifiers and then unwrapping that. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate this material before making any changes so that it doesn't change the original material. So I'm going to duplicate that and I'll rename that to stem large. And now let's go to render view. And now instead of using the UV as the vector, I'm going to use the object as the vector. And now let's increase this scale to maybe 15 or maybe 25. And now the texture is looking better. And now I'm gonna go to the color ramp and I'll preview this node, and I'm gonna make these colors brighter so that it's not that shiny, something like this. And I'll make this one brighter to something like this, and I'll move this to the right a little. And now let's preview that. And also I'm gonna delete this translucent BSDF and this hue saturation node and also this add shader by pressing Ctrl X so that the nodes are deleted but the nodes are still connected. And also I'm going to decrease down the subsurface scattering a little because this stem is a little bit harder and it doesn't pass that much light. And also I'm going to make this color a bit darker, but before I do that, I'm going to connect these lines at one point by holding shift and right clicking and dragging over these lines. And now these are connected at one point, and we can move that by pressing G. And now I'm going to move these nodes over here. And now I'm going to add a hue saturation node, and now I'll decrease down the value to about 0.7 to make that a bit darker. And now the soil material is left, but we'll make that later. And now let's populate the leaves on the stem. So for that I'm going to use geometry nodes, but if you want to use particle system, then you can use that also. So I'm going to go to the modifiers, and now I'm going to first collapse these modifiers. And now I'm going to add a geometry nodes modifier. And if you are fairly new to geometry nodes, then you can watch my tutorial on geometry nodes by clicking the I button or by following the link down in the description. And now I'm going to rename this node tree to leaves. And now I'm going to change the workspace to geometry node editor. And I'm going to collapse this window because we don't need that anymore. And now I'm going to add a point distribute node to convert our mesh into points. And we can't see any points until we increase this density. And you'd have noticed that when I increase this density to about 250, there are a very few points. And the reason is because the number of points on an object depends upon how much space is it taking in the world. So if I scale this object up in edit mode, you can see that more and more points start to appear. So instead of increasing this density to a very high value, so what I'm going to do now is first I'm going to change this density back to 1, and now I'll connect this density into the group input, and I'll move this over here, and I'm going to rename this to number of leaves. And now you can control this value from this modifier, but what you can do now is you can add a math node and now connect this over here. And now I'm going to change this to multiply, and now when we increase this value, more and more points are now spawned. And what's actually happening now is this density maximum value is now being multiplied by this number. So now we are getting more points. So now I'm going to change this value to about 100. And now I'm going to increase this number of leaves to about 25. And now let's get our mesh back by adding in a join geometry node. And now I'll connect this group input to the join geometry and this point distribute to the join geometry, and now this join geometry to the group output. And now we also get our mesh. And to keep these nodes organized, I'm gonna move this to over here, and now I'll add a point over here, and I'll move this to over here, and I'll move this to over here, and this one to over here, and also I'm gonna add a point over here, and I'll move this down over here. And now I'll move these nodes over here for more space. And now let's add a point instance node, and instead of an object we are gonna use collection. So now let's move these leaves into another collection. So I'm gonna move these into a new collection. I'll call that leaves. And also you can give this collection a color so that it's a little bit interesting. And keep in mind that we don't want any other objects in this leaves collection. But now if we add any object, so let's say I'm gonna add a cube, it will be now in the leaves collection. And the reason is we selected the leaves collection recently. So to prevent that from happening, just select any other collection. And now I'm gonna delete this cube. And now let's select this stem and now choose the leaves collection. And these are looking weird because the whole collection is turned on, so now turn that off. And now the leaves are so huge, and the reason is because we didn't apply the scale after scaling these leaves down. So now select these leaves and press Ctrl A and apply the scale. And now also we have to change the thickness of the solidify modifier because it's so thick. And I'm going to decrease down the thickness to maybe 0.0003, and also I'm gonna decrease this one to 0.0003 also, and this one also. And the leaves are rotated in a weird way, so now let's fix that. And one thing you should know is that if your nodes are not appearing in the geometry nodes editor, then the reason is you have selected a modifier other than the geometry nodes modifier. And this is new in Blender 2.93 that you can select modifiers. So if your nodes are not appearing, then just select the geometry nodes modifier. And to rotate these leaves, I'm gonna add an attribute randomize node, and I'll choose rotation from here, and I'm going to change this to vector so that we can control each individual axis, and now we can randomize the rotation of these leaves. But I'm going to set these all to 0, and now there's no randomness in the rotation at all. And now I'm going to randomize the Z rotation value a little. I'm going to increase the Z rotation value to something like this, and now I'll decrease this one down to something like this. And also I'm going to randomize these leaves on the x-axis so that some leaves are like pointing downwards and some of them are like pointing upwards, something like this. And also I'll rotate these a little on the y-axis also, something like this. And now let's randomize the scale also, and I'm gonna move these nodes to the left. And now let's add an attribute randomize node, and now let's type in scale, and by default the minimum value is set to 0, but I'm gonna increase that to something around 0.5. And now let's also increase the number of leaves. I'm gonna set that to 125. And now you can see that these leaves are starting to intersect each other. So now what we can do is change this from random to Poisson disk, and now we can set a minimum distance value. So I'm gonna increase the minimum distance value to 0.015. And you can see that some of the leaves are still intersecting each other. So you can increase this distance minimum value, but there will be a very few of the leaves left. So I'm gonna leave that as it is, and it's not a pretty big deal, and also you can notice that. So I'm gonna leave that as it is. And also these leaves are rotated in the same direction, but we don't want that. We want these leaves to be rotated in this direction, and also we want these leaves in the opposite direction also. So now I'm gonna create vertex group for the leaves. So now let's go to edit mode, and I'll disable this edit mode option so we can't see the geometry nodes in the edit mode. And now I'll select the vertices where we want these leaves. So now let's select these vertices, and we don't want the leaves to be over here, so I'm not selecting these vertices. And now let's go to the object data properties and create a new vertex group, and I'll call that leaves, and I'll assign these vertices to this vertex group. And now in the density we can select the leaves vertex group, and now the leaves are only on this side. So now I'm going to select all of these nodes which make up these leaves, and I'll duplicate that, and I'll connect the geometry to the geometry. And as we can preview nodes in the shader editor, we can preview nodes in the geometry nodes in the same way by holding Ctrl Shift and left clicking on that. And we can't see any leaves because the density is pretty low, so I'm gonna plug the density maximum into the multiply node. And now when we change the number of leaves, these two nodes will have the same number of points, because we are connecting the density maximum value into the same math node, and that's connected to the group input. And now let's rotate these leaves in the opposite direction. So to know that which value is working to make these leaves rotated in the opposite direction, I'm gonna add a combine XYZ node, and now connect this combine XYZ node to the minimum and the maximum vectors. and the leaves will have no rotation at all because the minimum and the maximum values are the same. So now we can change the z-axis value and see which value is working, and a value of around 3 is working for me. So now unlink this node, and now I'll set the minimum and maximum z values to around 3. Something like this. So now I'm going to delete this combine XYZ node because we don't need that. And now let's connect this point instance node to the join geometry, and now let's preview the join geometry node by holding Ctrl Shift and left clicking on that. And now you can see that the leaves are totally identical and these leaves are just duplicated. So to get randomness, there's a seed value in these nodes. So in the point distribute node, you can change the seed value to get a different location. And in this attribute randomize node, you can change the seed value to get a different scale value for these leaves. And now you get the idea. And now these are random and that's looking good. And also I'm going to change this x value a little to something like this. And also I'm going to add a point over here, and I'll move this down to over here. And now let's make the leaves on this stem also. So I'm going to go to edit mode, and now I'll select these vertices. Now I'm going to go to the object data properties, and now I'll create a new vertex group and I'll rename that to leaves 2. And now let's assign these vertices to this vertex group. And now let's select these nodes and duplicate them, and I'll move these over here, and I'll connect the geometry to the geometry. And now let's preview this point instance node, and also connect this density maximum to this math node, and in the density attribute change this to leaves 2. And now the leaves are over here. And now let's correct the rotation. So I'm gonna add a combine XYZ node. I'll plug the vector into the minimum and into the maximum, and now let's see which value is working. Something around 1.5. So now I'm gonna unlink this node, and now let's set these values to around 1.5. And now this is looking good. And also I'll change the seed value. And now let's connect this geometry to the join geometry node, and now let's preview the join geometry node. And also I'll add a point over here, and I'll move this to over here. And now this is looking good. And now let's make the leaves on this direction also. So I'm going to select these nodes, and I'll duplicate them and move these over here, and I'll connect the geometry to the geometry, and I'll preview this point instance node and connect this density to this math node. And now let's plug this combine XYZ node into the minimum and the maximum values. And now let's see which value is good. Something around 4.5. So now I'm going to unlink this node, and now let's set these to around 4.5. And now this is looking good. And also I'll change the seed values. I'm going to delete this combine XYZ node now, and I'll connect the point instance node to the join geometry. And now let's preview the join geometry node. And now these are looking good, and you can further tweak the settings if you want. But one thing I'll do now is, you can see that these stems end up at a leaf. So to make that, I'm gonna just duplicate that leaf, and I'll move that at the tip of the stem. And when you duplicate this leaf, you'd notice that there's a change in the leaves, and that's because when we duplicated this leaf, it's now in the leaves collection and we don't want that. So now let's move that into this collection, and you notice that there's no change in the leaves, and the reason is it's not updating. So what I'm gonna do now is I'll press Ctrl Z, and now it's in the leaves collection, and now I'll press Ctrl Shift Z to redo the action, and it's now in this collection, and also the leaves have been updated. So now I'm gonna move this to over here, and I'll rotate this. I'll move this over here. I'll move this to over here, and now I'll select the stem, and now I'll go to edit mode, and I'll extrude this over here, and I'll scale this down a little to something like this. And now I'll select this leaf, go to edit mode, and make sure that the bottom vertices are selected. Then I'll scale this up to something like this, and now I'll rotate that. And also I'll scale this down a little to something like this. And now this is looking good. And now you can duplicate these leaves and put that on the end of the other stems. And one thing I'd like to do in the leaves material is I'm gonna add a color ramp, and now I'll add some random greenish colors.
A few moments later.
And now I'll add an object info node, and I'll connect the random to the factor, and I'll connect these lines at one point by holding shift and right clicking and dragging over these lines. And now I'll add a mix RGB node, and I'll put that in here. And now I'll connect the color ramp into the color 2, and I'll change the blend type to Hugh Jackman. And now when the leaves are duplicated or instanced, they'll have a random color, and you can see the effect better if I put some weird colors. And also you can increase this factor value to increase the effect. And for the soil, it's better to make small particles of soil and then instancing that on this object to make the soil. But if I show that in this tutorial, the tutorial will be much longer. So for the soil, I'm gonna use textures. So now let's create a new material, and I'll rename that to soil. And now select the principal BSDF and hit Ctrl Shift T to add a principal texture setup. And now let's go to the textures. And now let's select the diffuse, normal and the roughness map and click on principal texture setup. And now it will add the textures by itself, and we have to unwrap our mesh. So I'm going to open up the UV editor, and I'm going to change the texture, and I'm going to go to edit mode and press U and choose unwrap, and I'll scale the UV down a little to something like this. And now let's go to the modifiers, and let's add a subdivision surface modifier, increase the level up to 3. And now let's add a displacement modifier, and I'll make a new texture, and I'll call that soil displacement. And for the coordinates, change that to UV and select the UV map. And now let's edit the texture, and now let's open up the displacement texture. And the strength is so high, so now let's decrease that down. And now let's add another subdivision modifier of level 1 to smooth this out, and I'll decrease down the strength to about 0.01. And now let's shade this smooth, and in the object data properties, the auto smooth is turned on, so let's turn that off. And now let's see how that looks. And I'll add a hue saturation node, and I'll decrease down the value to 0.6 to make the soil darker. And that's it for this tutorial, guys. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and smash that subscribe button and the bell down below so you won't miss any of my new videos. I'll be back.